let us begin. Who wants to go first? Maria?
All right, please tell me what new things you're bringing to Sun and Fun.
So, for the last 12 years, GAMI has been embarked on an effort to develop a high-octane, fleet-wide, drop-in aviation gasoline replacement for leaded fuel. And at Oshkosh last year, Earl Lawrence, who's head of all certification, otherwise known as Air-1, made the announcement at Oshkosh that the FAA had, for the first time ever, approved a high-octane, unleaded aviation gasoline. That was the good news. The bad news was it was limited to a small number, of aircraft and engines, and during the Q&A sessions, we told everybody at Oshkosh that we were still going to work and working well with the FAA, and that by Oshkosh of 2022, which is, 5 months from now, that we would expand the approved model list to include all of the engines, all of the spark ignition piston engines in the FAA's type certificate database, and all of the aircraft that use any of those spark ignition piston engines found in the FAA's type certificate database. Now, from our point of view, that is a fleet-wide approval without any qualification. Now, the Eagle people will tell you that's not a fleet-wide approval. On the other hand, if every airplane and every engine that now uses 100 low lead or any other variant of an approved aviation gasoline is on the engine AML, the engine approved model list, and every aircraft that uses one of those engines is on the approved model list for airplanes, then that seems to me like that fits the definition of a fleet-wide approval. Somebody else may have a different definition of what the fleet consists of, but I think that's pretty adequate. So what I can share with you is that on March the 2nd, we received an email from the FAA, and the email from the FAA said the following, and it's in the press release. It said, the Wichita Aircraft Certification Office advised GAMI has completed all, emphasis all, the necessary showings and findings of compliance and provided type, design data, and documentation required for substantiation of the requested expansion of the engine STC SEO 1966WI. Then there's this new separate sentence, and it says, the revised approved model list currently awaits FAA headquarters approval to sign and issue. So everything has been done as of March 2nd for the engine AML. I hold a copy of the engine AML here in my hand. This document is 18 pages long. It consists of row after row of individual make airplanes, and each make has a whole host of separate models under each make. This list, which contains all of the links to the type certificate database, so that if you look at it, say in a Word document or a PDF document, you can click on one of those blue items and it takes you to the FAA's type certificate database and brings up that particular type certificate sheet for that particular engine. This includes every single engine, spark ignition piston engine in the FAA's database. Plus, we have authority from the FAA that if one is accidentally omitted, that we are authorized to issue a 337 and approve it. So without exception, every spark ignition piston engine known to the FAA All of the certification work has been done pursuant to that March 2nd email. They're only awaiting the FAA in Washington to allow the manager in Wichita to sign this AML and deliver it to GAMI. The next day, on March the 3rd, we get another email that says the same thing, only it's in reference to all of the aircraft that use each of these engines. And the last line of that is, well, let me read you the substance. The AML for this STC from Oshkosh last year will be revised, very important language, and I'm going to read it slowly, will be revised to include those aircraft currently approved for operation on 100 low lead fuels, lower octane leaded and unleaded aviation gasolines, and MoGas to allow operation on GAMI G100UL high octane unleaded aviation fuel. New sentence. The revised AML currently awaits FAA headquarters approval to sign and issue. We're done, folks. The 12-year quest, we've quit loving the problem, as Michael Kraft said 12 years ago, and we've just fixed it. Well, we fixed it. That AML, and frankly on your video cameras today, is the first time anybody's ever seen this. What I'm holding in my hand is the approved model list for all of the aircraft that go with this set of engines. This document is not 18 pages long. This document is 51 pages long. Row after row of different make airplanes with literally hundreds of different models. I mean, you know, here's one here on a Piper aircraft, and it's got a make and a zillion different models. Okay. All of the certification work is done and finished and complete, and the only thing standing in the way of being able to start to produce and deliver fuel everywhere in North America or everywhere in the United States is the certification team in Wichita is waiting for a phone call or an email from Air One in Washington that says, go ahead and sign the STCs. It's a pure ministerial act. Somebody has to pick up a ballpoint pen and go to the cover sheet for this, and the manager of the Wichita office has to sign his name. And it's done. Questions? Anybody?
What do you think they're going to do? Is there some hold up at headquarters?
Oh, yes. Yeah. All that's the good news. You want to hear the bad news?
Yeah.
Starting in December, we were told about the 18th of December that FAA headquarters had decided to do a complete, beginning to end, 12-year audit of everything that had been done on our project. And they were going to get an independent FAA aircraft certification office to do the audit. So they picked the Atlanta Aircraft Certification Office to do this. And the Atlanta Aircraft Certification Office went to work, and God bless them, a bunch of good people, and they worked their backsides off. They actually postponed some of their Christmas leave. They worked every single day from December 17th or 18th through January 4th. Every single day except the 25th of December and the 1st of January. I stayed in my office. We're talking 7 days a week, 12 hours a day. I'm taking phone calls from Atlanta at 7 o'clock at night, sending them documents at 7 o'clock on Monday morning. And on January 5th, they sent their report to Wichita and to Washington. And the key language in their report is the following, and it's in the press release. It says, subject, STC, AML, etc., independent certification review. That's the highest level internal review the FAA can do on a project, an independent certification review. Sort of thing they do on a 737 MAX. Quote, the Atlanta branch of the Atlanta ACO branch reviewed the project-specific certification plans, the means of compliance, the methods of compliance, and all the associated documents. And then in boldface, based upon this review, our office finds the certification project showings were comprehensive and credible, and the proposed amended AML is suitable for FAA approval. Okay, are we done yet? No, we weren't. They decided to study and love the problem some more. They've been loving the problem through 4 successive holds on our project. Why? We've got no idea. And frankly, the certification team in Wichita has got no idea. But 2 weeks ago, we were told they still wanted to do one more. But we'll finish it by the 1st of May. I said, well, on the 2nd of May or the first week in May, are we going to have signatures on these 2 documents? Well, almost certainly. I said, well, that means maybe. I'm talking to Air 1 with Air 700 and Air 300 on the phone. Well, almost certainly. Well, that means maybe. Well, yeah, but George, almost certainly. So what's the output of this review? Well, they're going to make recommendations. Well, what if one of the recommendations is not to sign it? Well, that's really unlikely. I said, well, what's the process for resolving this recommendation? Well, we hadn't thought about that. I don't know what to say. This is unprecedented levels of interference in a routine. I mean, these aircraft certification offices, on their own, without Washington involvement, sign STCs every day, every month, without any input whatsoever from Washington. So one can only then start to speculate as to what is motivating the delays. And I can come up with 3 or 4 different theories, but it's probably not productive for me to speculate. All right, other questions?
Do you think it's just fear because it is a fleet-wide afraid of things?
Are they afraid of their own shadow? That thought's crossed. That's one of the hypotheses. Is this is a really big deal. They know it's a really big deal, and the question is they've got. I mean, the 3 guys that have done this project were handpicked by Air 1, Earl Lawrence, to do this in July of 2020 because he was frustrated that the project was stalled. I mean, he called me on the phone mid-July of 2020 and said, George, I've been looking at your project file. This thing's taken at least 5 years too long. This is almost a direct quote. Taken 5 years too long. There's been way too much high-level regulatory involvement and not near enough low-level certification activity. And I'm going to have everybody working on the project go do something or go do nothing somewhere else. And I'm going to put a whole new team in charge. And he did. And he put some really good people in charge. And we got more done in the next 16, 18 months than we'd gotten done in the previous 8 years. Because there wasn't any interference from the then dead PAFI project. I hate to say this, but a lot of the people that were working our project were working PAFI, and there was a sincere motivation coming out of the PAFI project to make sure that PAFI succeeded before we succeeded.
But didn't people say today PAFI was a testing program not designed to find a fuel? That's what he said.
So there's a question from this lady. And the question is, well, didn't Peter Bunce, the executive director of the General Aviation Manufacturers Association, say at his press conference this morning that the new reconstituted Eagle/PAFI program, its function was what now?
Testing.
Was testing, but it really wasn't to find a new fuel. That verges on the bizarre, arcane, absurd to say that. There's nothing could be further from the truth. Let me give you all an example. 3 weeks ago, they had this Eagle Forum in Washington at the National Academy of Science. And on the morning of the second day, I raised my hand and asked a question. I said, look, guys, you're talking about starting a whole new program. But for the last 4 years, the FAA has promised transparency. And that transparency consists of publicizing all of these so-called valuable lessons learned during the 8 years of the PAFI project that was funded with 80 million taxpayer dollars. The FAA has never released a single lesson learned to the public. in spite of the fact that all that data was paid for by the taxpayers. So what are you going to do about that? Because it seems to me like until all that data is public, there should not be any further follow-on program. The taxpayer should not spend one penny to conduct further secret research that does not benefit the community in general. Yeah, George, you're right. We've been intending to do that. We'll take an action item. We'll write that down and we'll get to it. Not a word in nearly a month. I don't frankly expect to ever hear a word. Only in Washington, D.C. can this kind of stuff take place. Question, somebody? How about here? Got one? You? You?
Yeah, sure. One of the questions, one of the things they brought up, more than one, is the other issues besides the safety of using the fuel in the aircraft, getting refiners to take it on, the transportation, the infrastructure around it, and what it does to fuel tanks.
All right, so
have you evaluated those?
Sure. Let me repeat the question. So the question is one of the issues that was raised at this Eagle Forum this morning, mostly by the executive director of GAMI, was, well, you know, one of the things Eagle's going to do is we're going to investigate and make sure that some new fuel can be properly distributed. What was the rest of it?
Well, it's got to be made by the refinery.
Yeah, or that the refineries are willing to make it, that it can be properly distributed. And
it's got to be distributed, and then they were talking about effect on the fuel tanks.
Yeah, all right. Material compatibility. Okay.
Yeah, okay.
So one of the very first things that we did, I mean, we like to think that we're pretty good engineers at our little company in southeastern Oklahoma. One of the first things we did 11 and a half years ago was to sit down and make a formal engineering requirements list. And on that requirements list, the first item was the detonation characteristics have to be the same with 100 low lead. Number 2 was material compatibility has got to be the same. Number 3 was the fuel has to be completely fungible with 100 low lead. You got to be able to mix it in the tank, in the wing tank of the airplane, in any fraction, any proportion. And for that matter, you got to be able to put it in the fuel tanks at the FBO in any proportion or any fraction. And it's got to go through the same distribution network. Well, if it's fungible with 100 low lead, then it automatically qualifies to go through the same distribution network. So that problem that was raised this morning is this big giant problem that they're going to spend $14 million a year from the taxpayers to study for the next 9 years. That problem's already been solved. Why are the taxpayers paying money to solve a problem that's already been solved? Explain that to me, somebody. I don't hear anybody explaining it. Did I finish answering all your questions?
I think so.
All right.
So pending that signature from Wichita, do you have a rollout kind of perceived? Do you know how much consumer demand with this fleet-wide authorization you're going to have?
I'm going deaf listening to my phone ring in my office from airports all across the United States asking when they can get a railroad car on the nearest siding to put this fuel on their airports. We're talking the Port of Portland, Oregon. We're talking all the airports around San Francisco Bay, Southern California, East Coast, Wisconsin, Atlanta. I mean, all those places are literally, you know what? And not a single one of them has ever asked how much is it going to cost. Believe it or not, I've not yet had that question. I mean, they assume it's probably going to cost a little more, and it will. But that's not the showstopper for them. The showstopper for them is getting rid of the lead.
But aren't you going to sell to the refinery that takes the crude and turns it into different petroleum products, including avgas?
Almost any competent refiner or even blender can make this fuel pursuant to, and this is an important subject that I probably should transition into. So, I'm going to let you close up this. What I'm holding in my hand is a license agreement. got it?
Let me get
You'll notice up here where my finger is, there's a big square box with a stamp on it. And it says FAA accepted, Wichita Aircraft Certification Branch, dated June 4th, 2021 at 8:48 in the morning. In a Zoom call with the FAA fuels people last year, a year ago last month, there was a discussion about quality control for an STC fuel. And there were people that were holdovers from the failed PAFI program that were saying, well, but you've got to have ASTM, otherwise, we don't have any quality control. So one of the perceptive FAA engineers asked a question. They said, well, what quality control does the FAA have over a fuel that's made pursuant to an ASTM specification? It got real quiet on that Zoom call. And ultimately, the senior technical specialist for fuels for the FAA said, well, actually the FAA has none at all. So what we devised as part of this license agreement that I'm holding in my hand, that is now FAA approved, we devised a license agreement, and any qualified vendor is eligible to take this license agreement and make this fuel. They've got to meet certain quality standards. Among the requirements are that GAMI, as the production approval holder for the fuel under the FAA's quality assurance system, which we have and have to maintain, and they audit, we have the right under this document to make random inspections of their production facilities and monitor their paperwork. In addition, in writing, we have the right to bring a representative from the FAA with us. Extensive resources from the largest single fuel distributor in the country, Avfuel. And under this license agreement, if there's a quality fallout that is not timely remedied in the same manner that any quality fallout happens for any part produced under a production approval holder authority, then the FAA can ask us to withdraw the license, and we're obligated to do that. This is probably virtually the highest level of quality assurance that you could ever even create a hypothetical example of for the FAA. So that whole issue about quality assurance is a complete red herring. It's got no validity to it whatsoever. Questions?
George, how simple or extensive are the changes that a refiner needs to make to their setup processes to produce G100UL?
So the question is how extensive are the changes that a refinery needs to make to be able to do this? Well, we've been in discussions with one fairly large entity, and they said, well, I think in order to get started with this, we've got to cut into one internal pipeline, put 3 valves on 3 sides, put a T on it, and run a line over to the ship canal so we can load this stuff out in barges. You think they know how to do that? Maybe? Come on, folks. We can make this fuel, we can splash blend this fuel on the ramp at our airport. I don't think this is a challenge for a refinery.
You have the patent on the...
We have patents as intellectual property. We also have a supplemental type certificate, which is another form of intellectual property.
So the refinery has to license the patent.
The intellectual property is licensed as part of this license agreement that you're looking at.
George, I'm going to bring up one of the other things that they said,
Sure.
which is transparency.
Yep.
And we talked about it after. And the issue they raised was that they didn't feel that they had sufficient transparency for your process and your testing, and that, if I I understand correctly, there are elements of your process and your testing that you consider to be proprietary, which you are not anxious to release.
So the question here is one that is repeated from statements made this morning by the Executive Director of the General Aviation Manufacturers Association, Mr. Peter Bunce. And I don't know, some of you all were there, but I think at least 5 times during that 40-minute press conference that Peter Bunce said, well, one of the real problems with the STC process is there's no transparency. And because there's no transparency, nobody's going to use the fuel or accept the fuel. Now, what he just did was to slap across the face, or even to roundhouse, well, let me give you a list. Cirrus, Cessna, Piper, Beechcraft, Continental, and Lycoming, to slap them in the face. Because every time they certify something, there's no transparency. Everybody relies on the FAA to do that certification. What they just said was that in order for Cirrus to certify a new airplane, they've got to go get Cessna, Piper, and Beechcraft to review their certification file so that they can have transparency for their new Cirrus design, or vice versa for a new Cessna design. That is probably the biggest single insult that anybody could throw at the FAA, is to challenge their level of competency. The certification people at the Wichita Aircraft Certification Office have stated on more than one occasion, and have stated to their senior management, that this is the single most carefully reviewed, vetted, studied, tested STC in the history of the Wichita Aircraft Certification Office. All of the test methods that we've used and adopted were vetted in detail and length by multiple groups of subject matter experts within the FAA, many of whom were working the PAFI project at the same time. So I think that claim is a complete and total, what's the word, red herring. Questions?
What you're saying is that the consumer might be iffy about getting STC fuel rather than
I have not yet run into a single pilot or airport manager anywhere in the country that has raised that issue. And we've talked to dozens of them in the last 3 or 4 months. The issue was that the ultimate consumer may be concerned about the lack of transparency. Well, they wouldn't even think to use that word unless Pete Bunce put it into the lexicon.
What about independent review of the quality of what you've done? Has it been?
So there have previously been 6 different independent reviews of everything that's been done for the certification. I can share some of that with you. Hang on one second.
Okay.
So briefly, when we got ready to do this, at the FAA's suggestion, we contracted with Embry-Riddle. And Embry-Riddle did a complete FAA Part 33 engine durability test using their aircraft, their engine, their mechanics. And the FAA out of the Atlanta office drove down to Daytona and personally supervised the original engine buildup and the testing and the subsequent engine teardown and all of the data. The engineers at Embry-Riddle wrote the reports. We never set foot in Florida for 8 or 9 months while that testing was going on. That's about as independent as it can be. In addition, we sent fuel samples to Cirrus Aircraft, and they ran their own material compatibility testing using exactly the same test protocols they had previously used with Hunter Low Lead, because Cirrus has got a fiberglass epoxy composite wing structure, which is pretty unique. And it passed with flying colors at Cirrus. They wrote the reports, their designated engineering reps signed them, recommended them, and the FAA accepted them. That's pretty doggone good independent review. At different times, there have been 6, other than the audit completed last January 5th, which is the 7th one. There's been 6 previous technical advisory boards, to coin a term that's just now come into usage in the last 3 weeks. The first one was on March 31st, 2010. There was over 20 FAA subject matter experts in attendance, including the chairman of the engine propeller directorate, Fran Favera, all of the FAA fuels experts from the Atlantic City test office, people from Atlanta, people from Fort Worth. There's 20 of them sitting around the conference table. All day deal. I still have the PowerPoint from that presentation.
You say 2010?
2010, 12 years ago this month.
Okay.
You know, 12, yeah, 12 years ago last week.
Yeah.
And then 4 months later, or 3 months later, on July of 2010, we did it again at the Fort Worth Aircraft Certification Office. There was about 10 managers and subject matter experts there. Then we had another tab kind of deal on October 5th and 6th in Ada, Oklahoma at our facility. And the FAA sent a room full of subject matter experts, including all their fuel experts and later involved in the PAPI project, including Lance Gant, who recently was Air 700. And we spent a day and a half doing that in Ada, Oklahoma, including watching the fuel run on the engine test stand. Then we did it again on May 18th, 2011. Only this time, guess where we did it? We did it in Washington, D.C. Where in Washington, D.C.? At 800 Independence Avenue, FAA headquarters. Where in FAA headquarters? Air One. A nice lady named Dorinda Baker, smarter than hell. She called us up there to do this. She put us in her conference room, and she was the one that supervised that technical review, which included some very, very bright FAA people. Subsequent to that, the FAA got money and hired an independent outside fuel specialist contractor that had recently retired from the petroleum industry, and put that person in the middle of our project for a year and a half to deal with issues involving material compatibility. That is somebody outside the FAA that third party vetted this. So then we did another one of these in February the 14th of 2012. That was done at the Small Airplane Directorate in Kansas City. They've got a big giant conference room there, probably 20, 25 chairs around the conference table, and another 30 or 35 chairs around the wall. Every chair was full with FAA engineers, managers, and we spent a day up there vetting this project. And then the following January, we did this again in Fort Worth. There's been 6 of these plus the audit, but apparently they want to do it one more time.
Give us an estimate of how many hours in the last 12 years and how much money have you guys spent?
You know, I have no idea. My son, when we got the STCs last year, called me up on the phone and said, "Dad, I want you to know you're the single most stubborn human being I've ever known." You know, look, this is the right thing to do. I soloed an airplane at Ada, Oklahoma on June the 7th, 1965 on runway 17. It's now runway 18 because guess what? Over the time, the pole has shifted. I mean, aviation is me, okay? And it was important that we get this done for all of general aviation. Any other questions?
Going to be a smooth transition. Is your fuel just going to, FBO just going to order your fuel instead of the 100 low lead? How's that going to work?
So very good question. The question is there going to be a smooth transition? Let me tell you how smooth it can be. Let's say your airport has got one tank for 100 low lead. Typically they're a 10,000 gallon tank. The typical transport carries maybe 8,000 gallons. So the FBO burns that 10,000 gallon tank down, and when it gets below 2,000 gallons left, in order not to run out, when say it gets to 1,500 gallons, he picks up the phone, he calls for a new order, a new 8,000 gallons. So this time, with 100 low lead, with 1,500 gallons of 100 low lead in the bottom of the tank, he calls up and says, "Send me a tank load of G100UL. Okay? Truck shows up, what do you do with it? Well, where's your other tank? Don't need it. What do you mean? Dump it in on top of the 100 low lead.
Makes sense, fine.
Because the FAA's approved specification, which I have in my hand, says that fuel that is conforming G100 fuel that is intermixed with conforming 100 low lead remains a fuel that conforms to the G100 specification. So by dumping the fuel in on top of it, you did not create 9,500 gallons of hazmat. You created 9,500 gallons of G100UL that is legal to be sold and traded in commerce.
You said that earlier, and one thing that crossed my mind, and I think it's a simple answer, but what if next time around, when I get down to 1,500, and you got a mix of unleaded and leaded, next time he gets 100 low. Maybe they flip it back and forth, back and forth, back and forth.
As long as there's some identifiable amount of G100UL in there, it remains a conforming G100UL.
So, 5 gallons.
In theory, yes. Nobody's going to do that.
I understand.
But there's no harm done.
Okay, well that's the answer. No
harm done.
So is your process, you're taking regular auto gas and converting it, or you're taking
No.
low lead?
You can't do that. Look, I mean, the fundamental problem with the approach that everybody took in the past to trying to solve this problem is, ASTM has a specification. It looks a lot like this page right here. If I take and put ASTM up here at the top instead of GAMI, it looks an awful lot like an ASTM specification for D910 100 low lead. So everybody said, well, what we've got to do is find a new fuel chemistry that satisfies all these performance criteria, distillation curve, density, vapor pressure, residual volume, net heat of combustion, sulfur mass, water reaction, conductivity, all these requirements. We got to find another fuel chemistry that meets this specification. When we started the project, we tried to be good engineers, and we said what we really need to do is to find a fuel that works and then write a specification around the fuel that works that absolutely characterizes the fuel that works. That's what we've done. Now, it just so happens that all the parameters on this page typically fall somewhere in between the existing parameters for ASTM D910 100 low lead and the existing parameters for FAA-approved unleaded motor gas. They're within those boundary conditions. So there's nothing, far out, wild, or anything else with where we ended up. But the engineering silliness, ill-advisedness, I don't want to say stupid, but of trying to spend all that time and effort for 30 or 40 years trying to find some fuel chemistry that fits some arbitrary specification, that was misguided from the very beginning. That's not the way real science is done. I'm sorry, it's just not. But it made sure that they never found a solution. And if you follow the money, the people that are selling leaded gasoline have a margin that runs from 60 to 80 cents a gallon that goes straight to their bottom line. Their margin on car gas is 2.5 cents a gallon. So they have an enormous economic incentive to drag this process out as long as they possibly can without finding a solution. If you follow the money, you start to find some of the motivation for all the delays that have taken place in this project. Questions?
Yeah, on the new gas, there's no problem with higher compression engines like a 9-to-1 or 10-to-1 compression?
I showed you the engine.
I probably wasn't here for that.
AML, there's 18 pages. Every single engine in the FAA's type certificate database is in this list. Without exception, every single spark ignition piston engine, regardless of the compression ratio, is in this list.
Typically a 10-to-1 compression ratio isn't necessarily a stock.
If there's an FAA type certificate for a 10-to-1 engine, it's in this list. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it should work now.
What about EPA? Do they have any standards that you have to meet? I mean, you're not going to be emitting lead, so that's good. But
so all of the components in this fuel are components that have been used in transportation gasoline around the world at one time or another. without objection with respect to the environment. There, we have a sample draft safety data sheet, and all the pictograms in it look exactly like the pictograms do in motor gas. Okay, does that answer your question?
Yes, sir.
So when you do your rollout, is there going to be anything for FBOs that they'll have to do other than just call and order it like they do their normal loads?
Nothing. Pick up the phone, call somebody that has it, ask for a tank, a truck, a transport truck.
Are you going to have certain areas that won't have it initially, or?
Sure. You know, the infrastructure in the world, and specifically the United States, you know, go to the Port of Los Angeles and look out across the harbor. We got some real fundamental infrastructure problems. Rail cars are scarce right now. So there's going to be lots of problems trying to roll it out. It's not going to happen overnight.
Where do you think it'll happen first? Which refinery do you think will?
I can't tell you. Okay, I'm sorry, but I've got a non-disclosure agreement. I can't tell you.
Do you anticipate it being pretty much seamless, though, from the standpoint of, you know, at the point that the FBOs have to stop using the 100 low lead, that they can switch to yours?
They can electively change anytime they want to that the fuel's available. They don't need permission from anybody.
Do you have an area you anticipate it being rolled out first?
Well, look, I've had a lot of early phone calls from places in Northern California. And just as a matter of common courtesy, knowing that there's some of those airports that have got bans on 100 low lead, I'm going to do everything possible to make sure they get some of the early shipments.
So there's already
I think it would be irresponsible not to address that problem.
So we've already got areas that aren't allowing 100 low lead?
Yes, Reed Hillview Airport in Santa Clara County is a prime example. They banned 100 low lead at midnight, December 31st last year. If you've got a 100 low lead airplane, you cannot fill it up at that airport and San Martin, one other airport out there. Other questions?
How much do you have to say about where it goes?
Well, in one sense, in one sense, none. But in another sense, we're not without influence.
Thanks, George.
All right. Thank you all.
Thank you.